On the morning of November 8, 2018, wildfire spread through the Northern California foothills town of Paradise. A town of 27,000 people was overwhelmed by fire, and in a matter of hours, 95% of the town was destroyed by fire. 18,804 homes, buildings, and structures were destroyed. 95% of the buildings in town were destroyed, were gone. A few months later, in February of 2019, I was in Chico consulting with a church and rented a car for the trip and drove up to Paradise and drove through the disaster area. And when I called Jennifer that night, I said I went to Paradise and I looked at it, and she said, "Did you take pictures?" And I said, "I didn't," for two reasons. One, my phone could not possibly have captured what I saw. And secondly, I was just so overwhelmed by grief at what I saw. It didn't seem right to be a gawking tourist taking pictures. 85 people lost their lives in that fire. 5 firefighters lost their lives in response to the fire. Most of the buildings in town were gone, including most of the churches. Did God cause the campfire that destroyed Paradise? On April 14, 2017, early in the morning, 2 Grand Canyon University students, sisters, left their dorm and headed out early in the morning to go to the Grand Canyon, a little road trip in the spring. On I-17, as they were heading north, their car was struck by a wrong-way driver. They were killed instantly, and the driver of the car was killed instantly. Did God cause that accident? In 2018, a friend of mine, an acquaintance, retired in his 70s, was on a ladder taking down Christmas lights, lost his balance, fell, hit his head, and was dead within a matter of hours. Did God cause that accident? In 2007, I had the funeral service for the baby born to a young couple that I had married a few years before. Their baby never left the hospital. In fact, never left the neonatal ICU unit, lived just 5 hours. Did God cause his death? In 2020, a novel virus called COVID-19 has killed 245,310 people worldwide, at least, and 67,535 people in the US. Did God cause this virus? See, being human means that we want not only to survive and come through suffering and illness and disaster and hardship, we have this deep down craving to understand it, to find meaning and purpose in it. And we especially crave understanding, why did this happen? Why did these tragedies, big and small, come into people's lives? We ask the questions, why do we suffer? Who caused this? Was it something we did or something we didn't do? And especially we want to know this, who is to blame for these disasters? Is it God? Is it the devil? Is it our fault? Or is there something else going on? Those of us who love God and follow him especially want to know, does God cause pain and suffering? Does he cause it as a punishment? To send us a message? To get our attention? Is God the author of disasters and pain and disease and death? We humans have been asking this question for a long time, and this morning I want to show you probably the oldest story in human history. It certainly is the oldest story written in the Bible. It's the story of Job, and I won't take us through all 42 chapters of that amazing book, but the beginning and the end are powerful, and in the middle is a lot of argumentation about who caused this pain. So Job is described as a man who was righteous and loved God and served him with his life. And yet the wheels fell off of his life, and to say he lost everything would be to to make an understatement. His children were killed. His physical health failed. He lost his wealth and his retirement savings. Everything in his life that he valued was gone. In fact, so gone was everything of value to him that his wife turned to him in desperation one day and said, "Friend, curse God and die." And Job said, "No, I won't. I still believe and I still trust him. And even though he take my life, I will still put my trust in him." And the question since Job, all the way through all of human history, has been, what happens when people suffer like this? What caused it? Who's behind this? What possible reason is there for it? So you get to the end of the story, and Job and his three friends, next week I'll talk a little bit more about Job's three friends who came to comfort him. But eventually they began disputing with him and arguing with him, and for most of about 41 chapters, they give their opinions about suffering and hardship and theology. And at the very end of the book, in chapter 42, God speaks with Job, and then he speaks with these three friends. And here's what he says in verse 7 of Job 42. After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz, who was one of the three friends who ostensibly came to comfort Job, this is God speaking, "I am angry with you and your two friends, because," listen, anytime you hear the word of the Lord say, "I am angry with you," you want to hear the because. You want to know why. You know, what did they do that made God angry? Here's what God said: "I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." In other words, what God is saying is, you've characterized me wrong. You have misunderstood. Instead of giving comfort and hope based on truth, you've made up stuff that makes sense to you, but is absolutely wrong and has misrepresented me. You have not spoken of me what is right. Listen, nobody deserves suffering less than Job, but nobody suffered more. Here are the two things that Job's friends got wrong in their chapters, days and nights long consultation with Job about the nature of suffering and the role of God in our lives when the wheels fall off. Here are the two things they got wrong. First, they believed God causes suffering as punishment for sin. They believed and told Job, the reason you're so messed up right now is because you're so messed up. All the pain that you're feeling, all the loss that you've experienced, that's all your fault. You brought this on yourself. And we can't tell you what your sin is because we don't know, but it must have been really great sin for you to suffer so greatly, because they had a view of the world that said God causes suffering as punishment for sin. And since you're suffering so greatly, you must have sinned really greatly. Their second mistake was to assume that good people never suffer. In fact, their whole view of the world and of God and of people said, if you're suffering, you've done wrong, and if you're not suffering, it's because you've done right. You see, they lived in a world and they believed in a world that was ruled by karma. Karma says you do good, you get good. You do bad, you get bad. I understand that there is a general principle, even repeated in Scripture once, that said we reap what we sow. But they took that principle and concept to an extreme level and said, if you have pain, it's your fault. And if you are good and live a righteous life, you'll never have a cancer diagnosis. You'll never bury a child. You'll never see someone you love go to prison. You'll never live through a divorce. You'll never have mental illness or physical illness. Their whole view of the world was that God causes pain and suffering as punishment for sin, and he rewards righteousness with an absence of pain and suffering. This whole notion has lived long past the time God said, I'm not happy with your answer. I'm not pleased with what you've said about me and how you've characterized my role in pain and suffering. This mistaken notion of Job's three friends lives on and has lived on for years. In the Middle Ages, women were burned at the stake for the heretical act of taking pain-relieving medications during childbirth. The thought was, if you have pain in childbirth, that's a curse from God, and you should just suck it up. You should just live with it. And so some women were killed because they tried to minimize the pain of childbirth. We've made some progress since then. some progress. In 1721, a smallpox epidemic burst out in the colonies in our country. And in Boston in 1721, some clergy members were opposed to the newly developed smallpox vaccine because they said it interfered with the will of God. Their thinking was, if people get smallpox and suffer and some die, well, that's God's will for them. And we should not interfere with God's will. You see, that's the thinking of Job's three friends. And I still hear it among people. I still hear this among Christians today sometimes saying this is what God's doing in someone's life. Let me try to give us a different perspective based on that word in verse 7 of chapter 42 in Job that says, you've not spoken accurately about me. You have not represented me properly. So let me try to represent more specifically and more accurately what goes on in the world and God's place in suffering. To do that, I want to tell you 4 stories from Jesus' life, and I'll be quick with them. 3 of them come from one chapter, and then one from another chapter in a different gospel. In Luke chapter 13, there are 3 stories about Jesus encountering people who were at difficult times in their life. In verse 10 of Luke 13 says, on the Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled, notice this, by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. And when Jesus saw her, he called out to her and called her forward and said, woman, you are set free from your infirmity. And then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Here's what I want you to see that Jesus is saying, and the gospel writer Luke, who happened to be a physician, says it was a spirit. Don't confuse that with the Holy Spirit or with the Spirit of God or the Spirit of Jesus. Jesus will make it really clear in just a second who that spirit was. It was the spirit of evil, the spirit of death and pain and suffering and disease and disaster. That's not from God. Later on, Jesus would be criticized for healing this woman because it was on a Sabbath. And some of the most religious people of the day, well, I call them the church people, criticized Jesus and said, you shouldn't have done that. It was on the Sabbath day. And Jesus answered in verse 16 and said, then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, be set free, even on the Sabbath, from what bound her? His argument with them was about Sabbath keeping and what's appropriate. His argument with us today is to say this illness in her body was not from God. He said it was from a spirit. He said it was from Satan, the embodiment of evil in the world. He said that's who had caused her to suffer. And it was his gift and his role to relieve her pain and to set her free. A second story earlier in this chapter, in verse 1 of Luke 13, tells a story about some people came to Jesus who said some Galileans had been murdered by Pontius Pilate while they were offering their sacrifices. And Pontius Pilate, not the wash his hands off kind of guy at all that we see later in Jesus' trial, here he took the blood of these people who he killed, mingled it with their blood offering sacrifices in the temple, and mocked their religion and took their lives. In verse 1, it says there were some present at the time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their own sacrifices. Jesus answered, do you think these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered this way? Listen carefully, he said. I tell you, no. He was answering the very same question that Job's 3 friends had gotten wrong thousands of years before. This didn't happen to them because they were worse sinners than their neighbors or the other people who were offering sacrifices that day. And then he goes on in verse 4 and says, there were 18 people who died when a construction accident happened. A tower in Siloam fell on them. And Jesus said, do you think they were more guilty than all the others living around them? I tell you, no. Here's Jesus answering so plainly that the murder by a corrupt government or an accident in a construction zone weren't the work of God. They weren't judgment for sin. They were something else entirely. Let me show you one more. It's from John chapter 9. It says in verse 1, as he went along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Here's Jesus' answer. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, don't misunderstand this. I don't think Jesus is saying that this man and his parents had never done anything wrong. That's not the point of what he said. What he's saying is, you guys are asking the same questions and drawing the same wrong conclusions that Job's friends raised thousands of years before. You haven't made much progress since then. This has nothing to do with the sin of this man or the sin of his parents. He was blind. And God will demonstrate his grace in his life, but don't connect his blindness to a curse from God or punishment for sin. It had nothing to do with that. Here's what I want you to hear about Jesus. He spent his life and his considerable powers fighting disease and despair, not causing them or even telling people that they should just accept suffering as justice from God. Later on, he would say in John 16, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. Man, do I crave that today. He said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Not only is there a message of hope there, but there is a message of explanation that says, Jesus didn't cause COVID-19. I'm so dismayed at some of the crazy things that I've heard people saying about this disease or other disasters that have happened over time. Jesus said, in this world, you'll have things like disasters and diseases. And he said, but take heart. I didn't cause them. I've overcome them. He is not the one to blame for these hardships. He is the one who gets us through them and carries us and loves us and suffers with us. So when bad things happen, why do they happen? Let me give you a handful of things. Sometimes we are at the mercy of other people who do evil in our lives, either out of evil intent or reckless disregard. Sometimes we're on the receiving end of other people's sin. Sometimes we make our own foolish mistakes. We didn't intend to screw up, but we did. Those are the times when we look back and say, if I knew then what I know now, I would have made a different decision. But some of us have suffered greatly financially or in our jobs or in relationships or some other ways because we just made a dumb mistake and didn't know any better. Sometimes we experience hardship because we willingly choose risky or dangerous behaviors. Enough said about that. Sometimes we experience hardship because the whole world we live in, including the natural creation, is bent and distorted by sin. We talked about last week that God made this beautiful creation and announced that it was very good. And then sin came and bent and distorted, not just part of it, but all of it. And it follows that sometimes the things that happen in our lives happen because the whole world is groaning in this bent and distorted shape, longing for the day of redemption. There's another reason. The power of evil in the world is still at large and is great. And the evil wounds, kills, and destroys indiscriminately. And there's nothing anywhere in Scripture that says that we who love God and follow him will be protected from it or will be kept from it. Jesus in his incarnation did not insulate himself or protect himself even from murder. So those are some of the reasons why things happen, but here's what I want to make really clear this morning. Don't blame God. Haven't we grown far enough to get past the disciples' question and Job's three friends pontificating wrongly? Don't blame God for the causes of sin and destruction in the world. Sometimes the things that we say make the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I hear people say things about someone who's died or about a crisis in someone's life, attributing that hardship to God and blaming him for it. And it sounds so religious and so pious, but ultimately it says God's to blame if you're suffering or if you've buried a loved one or if you've got a diagnosis that ultimately will take your life. Sometimes even claiming the sovereignty of God sort of blames him for what goes wrong in our lives. Let me give you a perspective on some different questions we should ask. Better than asking who caused this or why did this happen, maybe we should be asking, how will I grow through this? How will I grow through this experience? wherever it came from, whatever caused it, whether it's my fault or Satan's fault or some other evil person's fault or just a quirk of nature, how will I grow through this? Some of us have read the Gulag Archipelago, the massive work by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who went to the Russian prison in 1945 and was imprisoned for 8 years. His life was dramatically changed by that, and in his massive work, he writes this short sentence: "Bless you, prison. I have served enough time there. I nourished my soul there, and I say without hesitation, bless you, prison, for having been in my life." The worst 8 years of his life he could look back on and say, I grew through that time. Don't blame God for it, but make the most of it. Second question to ask is, how will my faith be stronger because of the hardship that I'm living through, or the hardship that I've gone through? I love this word by Rabbi Abraham Heschel. He said, faith like Job's cannot be shaken because it is the result of having been shaken. Isn't that good? Faith like Job's cannot be shaken because it is the result of having been shaken. Listen, when we are in hard times, that's a time and a place and a way that our faith can be strengthened. It's up to us to see it that way, to interpret it that way, to live with it that way. Two more questions. The third is, how can I experience the grace of God in this? How can I know that Jesus is with me, that he is closer than my pain, that he is nearer to me than when everything is happy in my life? How can I, in this dark time, in this painful time, in this lonely time, in this time of disappointment or despair, how can I experience the grace of God? It's there, it's available, it's for us if we'll reach out and grab it. The fourth question is, how will this deepen my compassion for others who are living through pain? I can tell you that the best comforters in the world are people who have been through hardship. The last message in this series on May 24th, Memorial Weekend, will be on this question: how can I help people who are suffering? Here's what I want you to believe this morning. God is not the cause of pain and suffering. He is the healer, the helper, the one who suffers with us, the one who suffered for us. The torture of pain and the torment of death are enemies that he opposed in his life, and he conquered in his death. That's why we follow him. That's why we love him. That's why we trust him. Jesus never told a suffering person that God had caused their pain or that they got what they deserved. He was unusually sensitive to the pain and suffering of people, and often, but not always, relieved their pain with healing. There is no example anywhere of Jesus ever using his supernatural power to hurt or punish or pay back someone for sin. Although there are lots of examples, including his words from the cross where he said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Look, pain and suffering are hard by definition, but blaming God for our pain and making us suffer only makes the pain that much greater and confusing. Making God the author of death and the cause of disasters, torture, and disease doesn't help anyone love him better or trust him more. Plus, it totally misrepresents who he is and what he is like. This week in Connect groups, and I know Connect groups are meeting by Zoom and Hangouts and every way they possibly can, you're going to have a chance to talk about some of these ideas and some of these questions. Some of us have wrestled with them, not in theory, but in real life. You'll have lots of opportunities to talk about it. This Jesus, who we follow and trust, did not live a life insulated from suffering. In fact, the pinnacle of his life was his suffering on the cross. The one who could have said, I'll take all of the human experience except death. I'll take all of human experience except shame for sin. I'll take all of human experience except disappointment and despair. I'll take all of human experience except for the bad stuff. He could have said that, but he didn't. He suffered for us. He suffers with us. And that's why we love him. That's why we trust him. And in his suffering, he defeated death. He defeated disease. He defeated the grave forever. And that's why we follow him. On the night the Lord Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said to his disciples, "This is my body, given for you." And he took the cup and said, "This cup is a new covenant in my blood for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me."